Google being a business that's mostly about advertising and within advertising mostly about search, then that top line number reflects the whole business. And it was an impressive number that, beat expectations, even though those expectations were very high.
Hey gang, it's Tuesday, November 9th. Paul and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Tenuity. I'm Marcus. Today I'm joined by our principal analyst who covers everything TV and video and heads up our advertising and media practice. It's Paul Verna.
Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for hanging out. Today's fact. The scientific name for a brain freeze is sphenopalatine ganglioneuralgia. Nailed it. Nailed it again.
Just trips right off the tongue, doesn't it?
Not with me. Eating or drinking something cold that gives you that sharp pain in your forehead, commonly referred to as brain freeze, but the scientific name for that intensely unpleasant common experience is that thing I just said that I'm not going to try and pronounce again. However, I do have a tip for folks. As you can tell from my pronunciation of that previous word, I'm not a medical practitioner, but a migraine remedy. So I had one of these recently, a hot shower. If you let the water hit towards the bottom of the back of your head, it feels amazing and will neutralize the migraine. It actually goes away. Now, I would stand kind of 1 foot slightly in front of the other and put your hand on the wall to stabilize yourself, because if you do have a migraine, you're already pretty disorientated, and with the hot water, it might be a lot. I don't want you fainting and then blaming me. I have that kind of money for a
Don't
lawsuit.
try this at home.
Yep. But it does really work. If you have a migraine or really bad headache, hot water, run it over the back of your head and it will go away. And then when you come out, it kind of comes back a bit. So that's not the only treatment. It doesn't disappear, but it will give you some relief for a while. Okay, medical advice out the way, thank goodness. Today's real topic, Google's ridiculous Q3. Paul, we're talking all about Google today and how insane they performed this Q3. We'll start with the revenue highlights and then just keep things going from there. The format we're asking a question. I'll ask Paul to fill in the blank and then explain why. That's how we do these earnings episodes. And then he'll put a grade on their performance and give us one takeaway. We then move to In Other News in the second half. So, Google's revenue highlights. They're packaged within Alphabet, but we're just going to talk about Google for this episode. So Google's advertising pulled in $53 billion in Q3, a quarterly record. Growth in Q3 was 4 times that of Q3 last year, reaching 43% year on year. Paul, the $53 billion that Google made in advertising in Q3 is more than the top 12 NFL teams' valuations combined.
Wow. Which
is madness. What's more interesting, though, is that somehow the Giants are the third most valuable NFL team. How the hell did that happen?
Well, the Mets are among the most valuable Major League Baseball teams, so it happens.
It's insane. What's going on in New York? Stewart, who runs the team, is a Giants guy. They haven't won anything since 2012, so God knows what's happening there. But you're right, yeah, the Knicks as well are up there. People lost their minds. Anyway, Google advertising, $53 billion. Most of that, 71%, comes from Google's search and other business. That was also up over 40%. So most of Google advertising comes from their Google search and other, 71% in fact. That was up over 40%. That's nearly 7 times faster growth than Q3 of last year. Google Network, that makes up 13% of the total, was up 22%. That was nearly 2 times faster growth than last Q3. And YouTube makes up the rest, 14% of the total that Google makes, and was up over 40% as well, pulling in $7.2 billion for the quarter. So Paul, Google search and other up over 40%, YouTube up over 40%, Google Network up over 22%. The revenue growth figures this quarter for you were blank.
Well, you used the adjectives ridiculous and insane and the noun madness, so you've kind of stolen a bit of my thunder, so I'm going to say bonkers. It was bonkers. It was a bonkers quarter. That's the headline.
Yeah. Why for you?
Well, because they, first of all, when people talk about the law of large numbers, the assumption is that when you get to a certain scale, your growth is going to be much smaller from quarter to quarter, year to year. Google
one would
seems
expect.
to have kind of thrown that concept out the window, and the quarters that they've had have just been astronomical in terms of revenue, in terms of beating expectations, and just in terms of really, really dominating the market, along with the other two legs of this triopoly with Facebook and Amazon, I would add. But clearly the pandemic has been very good for certain businesses, and this is one of them because following the very depth of when things started shutting down in Q2 of last year, since then, Google has just delivered again and again and again, record after record quarter.
Yeah, let's go back in history to 2019 for a second. I'll talk you through Google advertising growth each quarter. So in 2019, each quarter went 15%, 15, 16, 17, 15. Then 2020, 10% because of the pandemic, went down 8% in Q2, right back up to 9% by Q3. So 10, -8, 9. And since last Q3, it's gone 23% in Q4 of last year. Then this year, 32, 69 and 43% growth with just no indication of slowing down whatsoever. Paul, lots of numbers to unpack here. As I mentioned, a number of line items. There's Google Search, there's Google Network, there's YouTube, total Google advertising, there's the total number of dollars, there's the growth figures, and plenty of other numbers kind of swirling around within their earnings. What were the two most interesting revenue figures this quarter for you?
Well, I would say just the top line revenue, because Google being a business that's mostly about advertising and within advertising mostly about search, then that top line number reflects the whole business. And it was an impressive number that, beat expectations, even though those expectations were very high.
Yeah, still making over 80% of Alphabet's revenue, as I mentioned. I mean, at the beginning of 2018, Google ad revenue was 86% of everything Alphabet made, and today it's 82%. So still, to your point, makes up pretty much everything that the company is pulling in.
The second figure I would highlight is YouTube advertising, which was about $7.2 billion. Mm-hmm. And that was also significantly higher than this same quarter last year. But the interesting part is that it was somewhat below analysts' expectations, which probably says more about the expectations than it does about the business, because there's really nothing wrong with the numbers that YouTube hit. We can talk a little bit more about why that might have happened and what it means, but it's not a bad number by any stretch, but it's the one number that stood out because, well, along with Google Cloud, which was slightly below expectations.
Yes. Yeah.
But those are the numbers that stood out simply because what the street expected was a little bit higher than what Google delivered or Alphabet delivered. Yeah.
What do you make of YouTube's performance? It was, as you said, people were expecting more, but when you look at their numbers, what with that $7.2 billion, that 43% growth this quarter, last Q3 was 32% growth. What does that number say to you?
Well, the company did not give any indication as to why that number was what it was. My speculation is that one of the contributing factors is these traffic acquisition costs, which are basically what Google pays out to their partners. Mm-hmm. Those costs were somewhat higher than expected, and YouTube is very sensitive to those costs because of the way that business is structured. So that could be one thing. I think the changes in Apple's privacy settings probably had a little bit more of an impact on YouTube, simply because YouTube does depend quite a bit on mobile usage. And although Google obviously has its own mobile operating system, it's still very, heavily dependent on Apple. So I think those settings probably push down YouTube to a certain extent, and maybe to a somewhat greater extent than other parts of Alphabet's business.
Absolutely, yeah. Ruth Porat, Alphabet's CFO, said that Apple changes had a modest impact on YouTube, whatever that means. And then on the Apple changes, Daisuke Wakabayashi of the New York Times was saying Andrew Boone, who's an equity research analyst at JMP Securities, said Google was insulated from the effects of Apple's changes because many of its services are used heavily in web browsers, less on apps, as you mentioned, the apps that are subject to Apple's rules. Well, staying on YouTube for a second, Paul, two things. One, there was a bit of a mini YouTube milestone. So in Q3, although people wouldn't be at fault for not noticing it because it was ever so slight, but it still did happen. In Q3, YouTube accounted for slightly more dollars than Google Network for the first time. So of their three major line items, you've got Google Search, and other, you've got Google Network, and you've got YouTube. And YouTube's been catching up with Google Network, but it just overtook it in Q3 for the first time. 13.6% of all the money Google makes coming from YouTube versus the 13.2% from Google Network. We'll see if that holds. This is just one quarter. And then also, Paul, this was a point made by Daniel Frankel of Next TV. I'm wondering what you think of this because you cover TV and video for us. YouTube and Netflix now neck and neck. So YouTube's record $7.2 billion in ad sales in Q3. If you take that, plus it's, as he says, harder to decipher subscription revenues tied to various YouTube subscription brands, that likely pushes YouTube's overall revenue past the $7.4 billion that Netflix made in Q3. What do you make of this idea that YouTube is now a bigger video platform than Netflix?
Well, I think both of those milestones that you pointed out are interesting and maybe here to stay, especially the one where you look at YouTube versus Google Network. And the reason for that is that video is simply a rising tide within the digital ad world. And we see digital advertising increasing dramatically all across the board. But a lot of what's driving it is video and particularly connected TV, which YouTube is getting more and more involved in. So the health and the size of that business, it doesn't surprise me in the least because, YouTube continues to gain momentum. I mean, I've often said, this is a company that's now, 15 years old or more, and it's really been right in the zeitgeist of what people think of when they think of video every step of the way, whereas you see a lot of other companies go up and down. And yes, I understand that people have used the term existential threat to describe the potential effect that TikTok might have on YouTube. But I still see YouTube as inherently robust, very, very healthy, and that subscription income notwithstanding, which is very small within the scope of YouTube. Really, we're talking about an ad-fueled business and a company that has done a tremendous job of transitioning from a platform that advertisers didn't know what to do with and were afraid of to one that advertisers look at as very, very core to their campaigns.
Yes. Yes, it's kind of crazy to think that YouTube started 2005 as a dating site. And it's come on pretty far since then. You mentioned quarter campaigns. Daisuke Wakabayashi of the New York Times also noting that in a research note last month, Brad Erickson, an analyst with RBC Capital Markets, said that Alphabet was facing greater regulatory pressure, but that it was almost an unfairly good business. He noted that in conversations with advertisers, Google remains the, quote, first dollar of spend for any digital strategy. Another number that jumped out to me, Q3 net income, that nearly doubled year on year. $19 billion in net income versus 11 last Q3. That $19 billion would be more than the top 4 NFL teams are worth: the Cowboys, Patriots, Giants, and Rams. So as Ashley Gold of Axios so eloquently puts it, quote, Alphabet, that Google makes 80% of the money for, is still minting money, close quote. Paul, anything else on Google you want to talk about?
Well, first, just to put a point on that profitability number, it's staggering. And again, it's a testament to how robust the business is. Because it's one thing to generate tons of revenue, but a lot of companies do it at the expense of expenses. And that obviously is not sustainable, but I don't think that's the case at all. The one other thing I want to go back to, you talked about Google or YouTube in comparison with Netflix, and this shows how companies with complex business models like Alphabet or like a lot of the competitors in the video space, they're able to use these different businesses to reinforce each other, like advertising and content and devices and whatnot. Whereas I think Netflix is limited by their very simple and transparent model, which is simply just subscriptions. So it has more of a ceiling in terms of what it can do, Netflix does. Whereas I think YouTube, the more it grows, the more it can use different areas to, as I said earlier, to reinforce each other.
Mm-hmm. That's it for the lead story. Time now for the halftime report. Paul, I'll first have you put a grade on Google's performance, and then if you could offer us a quick takeaway from the first half.
Well, definitely I would give it an A.
Has to be.
Yes.
Has to be.
And I think the takeaway is that it's going to take a lot for Google to go off track, given just how strong its various businesses are and how central it is to advertisers' marketing strategies across a lot of different areas, from search to e-commerce to video.
Now that all the earnings are in, Amazon, Google, Facebook, I want to put together a triopoly, a triad, whatever you want to call it, episode, just to look at the battle between those three and how that's playing out. So stay tuned for that episode coming up in a couple of weeks or so. That's it for the first half. Time now for In Other News, but first a quick word from our sponsor, Tenuity. Gone are the days of brands spilling money into one colossal advertising campaign and then hoping it performs at scale. All advertising is going digital. All digital is measurable, and therefore all advertising is performance. Is your brand ready to rethink media, to rethink advertising, to rethink agencies? Rethink performance with Tenuity, the largest independent performance marketing firm across streaming TV and the triopoly of Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Find out how at rethinkperformance.com. All right, folks, we are back today. In other news, Nielsen rebrands itself. And who is the average Netflix user? Story 1. Nielsen rebrands itself with a new logo, corporate colors, and brand purpose amid measurement troubles, writes Ethan Jacob Kraft of Ad Age. Gone is the old blue N and the grey IELSEN to make up Nielsen. Here is the bold dark blue name with colourful mini triangles to the left. Where, Paul, I didn't realise this until it was pointed out to me by Mr. Kraft, where you can see the letter N in the negative space between the triangles, similar to the subtle arrow hidden in FedEx's logo. Very clever. It's been a variable year for the company. They sold their Nielsen IQ CPG retail measurement business earlier this year. Then the Media Ratings Council suspended its accreditation after finding out Nielsen undercounted TV viewership in February. The company is now refocusing on measurement, audience, and content products as they prepare their cross-media measurement solution, Nielsen One, for late 2022. Mr. Kraft notes. Paul, what's next for Nielsen, and how open is the door for competitors in the video measurement space?
Well, for starters, the rebranding in these days, you instantly think of Facebook. Obviously, Facebook is a name change. This is just a logo, but this really is not going to make any difference at all. When I looked at the two logos, the current one almost looked more modern to me than the other one. Although now that you point out this whole negative space thing, I do find that interesting. And when someone pointed out to me about the FedEx trucks,
oh, mind blown.
I have not been able to unsee it to the point that I think I'm maybe becoming a distracted driver, because every time I see a FedEx truck, I'm like, cool, look at the arrow. And I'm like, okay, keep your eye on the road, buddy. So yeah, Nielsen, changing its logo obviously is not going to change the reality that they are up against a lot of very, very tough challenges right now. Not right now, really, over the past several years. And the core of it is that the way they have traditionally measured television viewing and advertising has been, to their credit, an industry standard and, for generations, and the currency on which advertising is transacted. So they've been an enormously influential and important company in the TV space, but as viewing has fragmented, Nielsen has not kept up with the challenges of trying to measure that fragmentation, not to mention that with the pandemic, Nielsen misstepped because they were not able to update their panels, which require Nielsen representatives to physically go to people's homes and inspect equipment and just very old school stuff that doesn't seem made for these times. So the challenges that TV networks and distributors and all of the intermediaries that facilitate ad transactions on video and connected TV platforms, all of that is just infinitely more complex than simply having these boxes in people's homes that people have to, activate when they start watching a program. So there's a lot of a big uphill battle for Nielsen.
Story 2. Netflix just reported 213 million users in Q3, 74 million of them coming from the US and Canada. Who are they exactly? Who is the typical Netflix subscriber? Well, according to a Morning Consult Brand Intelligence June to September survey of over 500,000 Americans, how's that possible? Netflix's average user is a millennial who earns less than $50,000 a year. The average Netflix user is more likely to be female, but only barely. And 2/3 of Netflix subscribers have some or no college education. About 1/3 have at least a bachelor's degree, notes Katie Canales of our sister company Business Insider in a write-up of the survey. Netflix people also tend to live in the suburbs and lean a little to the left. Paul, your biggest takeaway from the survey was what?
I was surprised by the income level and education level because for whatever reason, I assumed that the average Netflix viewer maybe was a little bit higher on both of those scales. And part of the reason for that is that it's not an insignificant cost. So, if you're earning under $50,000 a year, you probably are living on a more modest budget and have to be more careful about what you subscribe to. But then again, it goes to show you that Netflix is considered essential viewing by almost everyone. So if people are going to use one platform, it's very likely to be Netflix. And I think this underscores that. Morning
Consult had an excellent point. They compared the data to that of the average US citizen per census data, and they found that the profile of a Netflix user looks very similar to the profile of an everyday American. So they pointed out that 68% of Netflix users don't have a bachelor's degree. 69% of US adults also don't. 15% of Americans make over $100,000 a year, and 17% of Netflix users are also in the same economic position. So, yeah, very interesting indeed.
As Netflix goes, so goes America, or is it the other way around?
It's both. It's both. That's what we've got time for this episode. Thank you, Paul, for hanging out.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, thank you to Victoria. She edits the show. Thanks to everyone listening. We'll see you tomorrow for a special edition of the Behind the Numbers Brand Anatomy, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Tenuity. In tomorrow's episode, our very own Jeremy Goldman hits the showroom floor of Web Summit in Lisbon to bring you the highlights and most interesting conversations from the event. Sierra Mist or Sprite, the good thing about it is once it goes flat, what's good to do if you've got like a fountain soda? I guess it technically works. Well, fountain soda is more likely to go flat than a bottle. But if you have a fountain soda of Sprite or Sierra Mist, if you put it in the fridge, like if you have some of that one day and then the next day you put it in the fridge, the next day it makes for a really hyper refreshing lemon and lime drink. It's still water, but it's especially if you put it in the fridge, it's incredibly surprisingly refreshing.
Not as carbonation dependent as other drinks.
Yes, exactly. Carbonation dependent.
Do we get paid for this?
For this part of the episode?
Yeah, I mean, are they sponsoring?
Hell yeah.
Product placement?
They should sponsor us.
They should.
Sierra Mist, get on it.